Resident Evil 8's game design is a bit of an up and down affair. Starting off positive, the game does reward you for your exploration with lots of loot, mostly in the form of money for the shop, as well as the occasional mini-boss and some permanent upgrades to both your health and your mobility. If you choose to go hunting through the game's nooks and crannies, you'll probably find something that was at least mostly worth your time. Another positive is that the game does make an active effort to guide the player through the use of colored tape that stands out from the background. These mark objects in the environment that can be interacted with, and many times these are directly needed to progress in the game, such as levers or locks on doors. They also tend to be used to mark ledges, breakable items, and also bookshelves that can be used to stop pursuits from enemies. Both of these things are positive marks in favor of the game's good game design. However, it's in the game design that we also see some of the game's most glaring flaws very early on in the form of a lack of internal logic and consistency. For example, the game relies very stubbornly on scripted cutscenes that must play out in a very specific way, meaning that the player will be randomly teleported to a completely different location of the map when certain conditions are met. So, here's how this is going to play out, right? We are going to end up getting in a fight with everyone, and at the end of that, we're going to get bitten, we're going to get thrown backwards, and we're going to end up right up there. Right here. We're gonna get thrown to right here-ish, I think. You're in my way. Oh no, I'm wrong. We're gonna get tossed to right around here. Right around this area right here. So I'm gonna try to be as far away from there as possible when we get to the pre-scripted area. I'm okay. Oh, here we go. This is it. You guys see where I am, right? Woo! Man, he just just really picked me up and threw me a block, huh? We got teleported from all the way over there. So I got thrown through a corner of a building all the way over here. In the worst instances, areas sometimes look as though these interactions never even took place and the cutscene never actually happened. Not to mention that the difficulty spikes unexpectedly hard early in the game, which can be seen as both a good and a bad thing from a design standpoint. Specifically, what I'm talking about is that the enemies in the early game are very bullet spongy and difficult to kill with a starting handgun and knife. This is good and bad for a couple of reasons. Good, because it establishes the difficulty you can expect from most of the rest of the game early on, as well as making you dread getting into fights with its enemies. But bad, because making enemies seemingly unkillable early conditions the player to think that combat is always a bad thing, and having high difficulty just because your enemies have a lot of health is a bit lazy from a mechanical standpoint.
Why won't you die?
All of the main areas of the game are all interconnected through the village as a hub, which is ironic considering you're going to be spending most of the time in the other areas that aren't actually in the village. However, within different areas such as Castle Dimitrescu or the factory later on, different floors all flow together and interconnect in satisfying and fluent ways that lessen the likelihood of hitting dead ends and getting stuck. Incidentally, if you do hit a dead end, it's likely just because you're missing some necessary item to progress, and you'll likely find a clue as to what you're looking for at said dead end. Once you find that item, you can backtrack to where you got stuck and progress later. It's a very Metroidvania design choice that doesn't actually feel too out of place here. Where the game does lose points, however, is world cohesion. It's hard to believe that this tiny, remote, nearly unknown farming village is surrounded by an immense bourgeois castle, a factory capable of producing military hardware and cybernetics, and also a waterfall that must be a wonder of the world that just isn't on the books yet. With that being said, though, it doesn't lose too many points, however. Each of these areas blends seamlessly with the village as their center point, and there isn't any sort of jarring transition of terrain or loading screens needed.
Ironic.
The concepts of the areas aside, the way that those areas have been designed to interconnect has been done very well. Each of the connecting routes to said areas introduce a small difference that lets the player know where they're going. The lake has the giant piles of ooze, the factory has the fenced scrapyard, the dollhouse has the garden, which is actually foreshadowed if you look around in the village after you get out of the castle long enough. And the castle has its own underground pathways and architecture. All of these factors, plus a very solid map system, makes it so the player is almost never able to really get lost or forget exactly which area they're in. All of that positive function, plus the variety that each of the areas provides, allows them to be memorable. Aside from the odd animation or two and weird teleporting during the cutscenes, which I've already chalked up to a lack of attention to detail or stubborn adherence to the cutscene idea, I never experienced any major glitches of any kind. There weren't any consistently distracting bugs, let alone anything game-breaking. My only issue would be a lack of optimization. I'm running somewhat older hardware even though it's still on PC, and my computer can sometimes struggle to run it well, but with the amount of tweaking to game performance that RE8 lets you do in the settings, that's hardly a point. If anything, it deserves praise for the flexibility that it provides to you in those settings, in addition to literally graphing out the performance toll to you. Resident Evil 8 takes the same gameplay systems from RE7 and doesn't try to fix what's not broken. It's the same first-person shooter formula with the ability to block an insta-turn. Crafting is also back in the similar vein, as are the unique permanent upgrades to Ethan. The latter is actually the best thing I can say about the game's mechanics and the most unique change that's been made. Resident Evil Village takes the concept of coins for items in cages and transforms it into something organically interactable in the world. Instead of collecting arbitrary items for rewards and being, well, I guess kind of ironically a video game, the game actually gives context by changing those buffs into hearty meals for Ethan to eat. The ingredients for which are scattered throughout the world in the form of rare birds, fish, pigs, and other animals. Other than that, though, the game really doesn't do anything special or new. It doesn't ruin the foundation that Resident Evil 7 laid, but it also doesn't try to grow from it and evolve either. That said, that foundation was to give the player the ability to defend themselves with weapons and a block, while also restricting their mobility with some relatively cumbersome and clunky movement, which makes encounters more awkward and stressful, thus pushing the horror point. It's a proven foundation that works for an action horror game like this, and Resident Evil Village wears it well. Resident Evil Village really does everything it can to hook the player as soon as humanly possible, and as aggressively as humanly possible. It throws you into the deep end immediately by killing your wife, kidnapping your kid, and villainizing the series' long-running protagonist Chris Redfield for doing both.
Sorry, Ethan. Why?
Before promptly caving your face in with the butt of a rifle. Your character motivation isn't so much handed to you as it is beaten into you with a good old dose of military police brutality. After that, a surprisingly colorful cast of characters steal the show in whatever scene they're in. The few scenes that they're in. Most of them. Looking at you, Moreau. Lady Dimitrescu, aka Vampire Mommy, please step on me, has a regal and sensual appearance that hides a completely psychotic cannibalistic drive to consume the blood of men, as well as a swath of unique anger issues. Not to mention the real goat of this story, Heisenberg. He and his Lycan enemies provide a werewolf yin to Dimitrescu's vampire yang. He also swaggers through every scene with both an air of charisma and calm menace to let you know that he's both dangerous and that he has more going on than the other typical horror game villains that surround him. Overall, though, the narrative through-line is finding your kidnapped/stolen plot MacGuffin by scouring and/or murdering your way through 4 main areas/levels, noble houses, and confronting the deity of local cult du jour, Mother Miranda. If this was all the game had going for it, the story would be pretty weak and cliche, but the bosses help to carry the plot in spite of that, and the game does 2 major important things. First, it serves the purpose as a lore prequel for the entirety of the Resident Evil franchise, explaining the true origin of the Umbrella Corporation's founding. And second, it does eventually address the biggest glaring writing plot hole in both this game and Resident Evil 7. How on God's green earth Ethan keeps getting away with and somehow he still manages to hold a gun.
Who knows? Maybe the real emotional through line of RE7 and 8 is just the devs learning to deal with their crippling chirophobia.
The game unfortunately doesn't do a whole lot to stand out from its horror contemporaries in the department of visuals and sound design. It still goes for a grungy, realistic style that's mostly gray and brown with a few standout exceptions, and the OST doesn't really provide anything that's particularly memorable. Nothing really made me sit and hum afterwards. Probably the main consistent theme you're going to be noticing at this point is that the game really doesn't do anything wrong, it just doesn't do anything outstanding. It's functional, it works. Much like the mechanical foundation that's pulled from the previous game, the visual and sound design serve its purpose well, without pushing the envelope with much in the way of overtly new ideas. It does get bonus marks in sound design for one particular detail, however. Whilst wandering through the Castle Dimitrescu, Lady Dimitrescu will stalk you after a certain part in the game until you eventually defeat her. While in the castle, you can hear her footsteps echoing through the castle halls and through the walls of your hiding places. This not only provides a sense of dread, knowing that the as-of-yet unkillable vampire mistress is skulking nearby, but it also informs you on whether or not it's safe to proceed.
She'll make the best vintage yet.
I'm sorry? Whoa. And speaking of Metroidvania elements, it brings back a startlingly similar energy to the SAX and Metroid Fusion. The game barely exceeds its goal of 12 hours of content. Barely, and it only did so because I'm a really thorough player. If I had rushed even slightly, or had an easier time with the enemies early on, my first playthrough could have even been a lot shorter. But it's not fair to judge off of conjecture and hindsight. We have to go off of what actually happened on first playthrough. That said, I do think it's fair to cut back a bit and say that you will probably get around 12 hours of content for your first playthrough, if only just. You may be compelled to even go back and play more if you're an achievement hunter, a completionist, or just a big fan of Resident Evil and want to hunt down all the juicy little lore bits, but your mileage will very much vary with this game based upon your taste. For me, that amounted to an extra 4 hours of gameplay after my first playthrough for around a total of 18 hours of total gameplay. Now, I'm gonna be completely honest, I was really lukewarm on this game when I first played it, and that's actually putting it a bit nicely. I really didn't like this game, actually. The whole bit about it going and pulling you out and restricting you in the cutscenes drove me absolutely insane, and I completely hate it. Also, Ethan's a freaking moron. Like, there are just times that it just does not make sense what he does, and it just serves to, honestly, just be torture porn for the sake of torture porn. Like, when the first thing you can interact with is barbed wire, and there's an obvious hole you can just crawl through, Ethan goes and grabs the barbed wire and slashes the side of his hand open, but the very next thing, when he gets trapped and has to crawl under something, he actually just crawls under it, which means he's capable, he knows, and he just didn't for some reason. Not to mention that the first enemy had so much health relative to the amount of ammo that you had, and the fact that the knife does almost literally nothing outside of breaking stuff. I literally thought that I was doing something wrong. I thought that I had to run, I thought that I had to leave, I thought that I had to do something else. And I legitimately questioned whether or not I was actually meant to be able to defeat the enemy, or if, you know, it was just supposed to be something oppressive and scary until I found a way out. And you were supposed to kill it, so... But Vampire Mommy was great, and Heisenberg was really cool, and the dollhouse was really scary, and I kinda wish it was just more of the dollhouse and more of Heisenberg, but we're gonna ignore that. Anyways, in terms of my personal opinion, I give the game, like, a 5. Like, it was decent, it was competent. That's the typical, I think that's kind of the running theme here, is that it was just solid. Like, it's a decent game. I didn't love it, But, ignoring what I think, is the game actually good? I want to thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate you sticking it out with me and the fact that I finally got an actual review out. I hope you all liked it, and I hope that this is going to be the start of a beautiful, beautiful friendship. See you next time, and stay excellent.